remember the exact moment it all fell apart. The air was thick with the smell of chlorine, sunscreen, and the faint hint of grilled burgers. The kids were screaming and laughing as they cannonballed into the pool, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls. I sat on one of the patio chairs, my legs crossed awkwardly under my cover-up, pretending to be interested in a conversation about some Netflix show I hadn't seen. My drink was sweating in my hand, condensation dripping onto my lap. I kept glancing at my husband across the yard. He was standing near the grill, shirt off, beer in hand, laughing loudly at something one of his friends said. His face was flushed, not from embarrassment, just from the sun and probably the alcohol. He looked comfortable, too comfortable. It wasn't like I hadn't noticed. Over the past few years, his body had changed. We both had. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him without a soft curve to his stomach or the slight sag of his chest. Not that I was perfect. God knows I had my own issues with the mirror, but it felt different for me. I tried. I dieted. I squeezed into shapewear and apologized when I indulged in dessert, and there he was, bare-chested in front of everyone, seemingly without a care in the world. It wasn't fair. I don't even know what made me say it. One of the women, Tracy maybe, had made some comment about summer diets, a throwaway remark about how hard it was to resist the chips and queso when swimsuit season was in full swing. Everyone laughed politely, and I saw my moment. "Maybe we should get him on one," I said, tilting my head toward my husband with a grin I hoped would read as playful. "You know, just a little motivation." My voice was light, airy, but I felt the words land heavy in the middle of the group. He turned slowly, his smile fading as his eyes locked on mine. The yard felt quieter, like even the kids had stopped splashing to listen. His face didn't twist in anger right away. That might have been easier to handle. Instead, there was this flash of something, confusion, hurt, before his expression hardened. "Really?" he said, his voice louder than it needed to be. "That's what you think of me?" I laughed nervously, waving my hand as if I could erase what I'd just said. "Oh, come on," I said, my tone edging toward defensive. "It was a joke, don't be so sensitive." But he wasn't laughing, and neither was anyone else. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing just enough for me to notice. "A joke," he repeated, as if he were trying to taste the word. He shook his head, let out a short, bitter laugh, and then turned back to his friends. Just like that, the conversation was over, but the tension lingered. I could feel it pressing down on me like the heat of the sun, unbearable and inescapable. The rest of the party passed in a blur. I don't remember much after that. I tried to focus on small talk, sipping my drink and forcing myself to smile whenever someone glanced my way. But my husband's presence loomed like a shadow. He didn't come near me for the rest of the afternoon. Not to check in, not to refill my drink, not to say goodbye when people started leaving. By the time the last guest had gathered their kids and pool floaties and headed home, I was sitting alone on the patio, staring at the water and wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. When he finally walked back out, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. He didn't sit down. He didn't even look at me. He just started gathering the empty cups and plates, dumping them into a trash bag with quick, jerky movements. I watched him for a moment, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he didn't. So I did. "You're really mad about that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. It wasn't the best opening line, but I didn't know what else to say. He froze, the trash bag dangling from one hand, and turned to face me. "Mad," he said, his tone low and steady, the kind of calm that felt dangerous. "I don't even know what to say to you right now." "Oh, come on," I said, standing up and crossing my arms. "It was a joke. You're blowing this way out of proportion." "A joke," he said again, shaking his head. "Right. Because it's hilarious to insult your husband in front of all our friends." I felt a flicker of guilt, but I pushed it down. "It wasn't an insult. You're taking it too personally. And you're not taking it personally enough," he shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "You humiliated me. Do you even get that?" "I didn't humiliate you," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. "You're overreacting." He laughed bitterly, a sound that felt like a slap. "Of course, I'm the one overreacting, not the person who couldn't help but take a cheap shot at me in front of everyone." "It wasn't a cheap shot," I snapped. "God, you're acting like I called you." I stopped myself, realizing I didn't know how to finish the sentence. What? Fat? Wasn't that exactly what I'd done? He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head, dropped the trash bag at his feet, and walked inside. The sound of the sliding glass door closing behind him was louder than it should have been. A punctuation mark at the end of an argument I wasn't ready to finish. I stood there for a long time, the evening air cooling my skin as the sun dipped below the horizon. The pool lights flickered on, casting rippling shadows across the patio. I stared at my reflection in the water, distorted and unsteady, and wondered why I couldn't seem to stop hurting the one person I was supposed to love. I didn't follow him inside right away. I couldn't. The weight in my chest felt too heavy to move with, like someone had filled my lungs with stones. Instead, I stayed out on the patio, staring blankly at the pool, letting the hum of the filter and the distant chirp of crickets fill the silence. I replayed the scene in my head, dissecting every word, every tone, every glance. It was like trying to solve a puzzle that kept changing its shape. Was it really that bad? I hadn't meant to hurt him. It was just a joke, something to lighten the moment, to make everyone laugh, to deflect attention away from. What? From me? From the fact that I hadn't dared take off my cover-up all afternoon, sitting there sweating under layers of fabric while everyone else walked around carefree. Maybe that was it. Maybe I'd wanted to shift the focus, even for a second, away from my own insecurities. But it wasn't like I'd called him lazy or disgusting. I hadn't pointed and laughed or made some cruel, cutting remark. It was one word, one stupid word. Was that enough to ruin the entire day? To make him look at me like that, with so much hurt and disappointment, I sighed and finally forced myself to go inside. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the living room lamp. The trash bag he dropped was still sitting by the sliding door, a silent reminder of the argument. I stepped around it, my bare feet sticking slightly to the tile, and made my way to the kitchen. He was there, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, a half-empty glass of water sitting beside him. He didn't look up when I walked in. I hesitated in the doorway, suddenly unsure of what to say. The words I'd been rehearsing on the patio, apologies mixed with justifications, felt flimsy now, like paper in a rainstorm. "Hey," I said softly, taking a tentative step forward. "Nothing," I cleared my throat. I didn't mean to upset you, really. I was just joking. You know that, right?" He let out a sharp breath, almost a laugh, but it wasn't the kind I wanted to hear. "Do I?" he said, finally looking up at me. His eyes were tired, his expression hard. I shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "Yes, of course, I mean, come on, you know me, I wasn't trying to be mean." "Maybe not," he said, "but you were." I blinked, thrown off by the simplicity of his response. There was no anger in his tone now, just a quiet certainty that cut deeper than any shouting ever could. "Well, I'm sorry," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "If I hurt your feelings, I'm sorry, okay?" He shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "That's not an apology," he said. "That's damage control." "What does that even mean?" I snapped, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "I said I was sorry. What more do you want from me?" "I want you to understand," he said, his voice firm but steady. "I want you to actually think about what you said and why you said it, and I want you to stop making me feel like I'm the problem every time you cross a line." My mouth opened, ready to fire back with some rebuttal, but the words caught in my throat. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't storming out or slamming doors or throwing accusations. He was just standing there, looking at me like he was tired of fighting, tired of trying. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I crossed my arms over my chest, suddenly feeling exposed. "It was one comment," I said quietly, almost to myself. "It's not like I don't know, insult you all the time or something." "No," he said. "You don't, but you pick your moments, don't you, when there's an audience, when you can hide behind a laugh and pretend it's all in good fun." "That's not fair," I said, my voice trembling. Do you even hear yourself?" He interrupted, his tone sharper now. "You're more focused on defending yourself than on how you made me feel. You keep saying it's not a big deal, but it is to me. You don't get to decide that for me." I stared at him, my mind racing but failing to come up with a response. He was right, wasn't he? I hated the thought, hated the way it made my chest tighten and my eyes sting, but I couldn't shake it. I didn't mean to hurt you, I whispered, my voice cracking. He nodded slowly, his expression softening just a fraction. I know, he said, but you did. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. I don't know how to fix this. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair, looking as though he was carrying the weight of both of us. I don't either, he admitted, but I know I can't keep feeling like this. Like I'm the punchline to your jokes, like I'm not enough. The word hung in the air between us, echoing louder than anything else he'd said. Not enough. It wasn't what I'd meant, it wasn't how I saw him. But wasn't that exactly what I'd made him feel? I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was more than enough, that I loved him and I didn't mean any of it. But the words felt stuck, like they'd be hollow if I said them now. So instead, I nodded, tears blurring my vision, and whispered, I'll try to do better. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, looking at me like he was waiting for something more. But when it became clear that I didn't have anything else to give, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the sound of the faucet dripping and the echo of my own failures. I spent the rest of the night lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the faint hum of the fan. The space beside me felt impossibly empty, even though I knew he was just downstairs on the couch. I could imagine him there, one arm draped over his eyes, the other clutching his phone or the remote, trying to pretend he wasn't as upset as he clearly was. I'd thought about going to him, slipping down the stairs in the dark to apologize again, to say something that would make it better. But every time I pictured it, I saw the way he'd looked at me in the kitchen, exhausted, distant, and I couldn't bring myself to move. I told myself it was because I didn't want to push him, to make things worse, but deep down I knew the truth. I was afraid that I'd already done too much damage, afraid that even if I said all the right things, it wouldn't be enough. The hours dragged on, the darkness outside giving way to the pale gray of early morning. I didn't feel rested, but I couldn't stand lying there any longer, trapped in my thoughts. I got up quietly, careful not to make too much noise as I slipped into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The woman staring back at me in the mirror looked as tired as I felt. Downstairs, the house was still. The couch was empty, the blanket neatly folded and draped over the backrest. My stomach sank. I knew he hadn't left. His car keys were still on the counter, his shoes by the door. But the idea of him waking up before me, starting his day alone, made me feel like I'd already lost some unspoken battle. I found him in the backyard, sitting on one of the patio chairs with his phone in one hand and a steaming mug of coffee in the other. He was still wearing the same clothes as the night before, his hair sticking up in every direction. For a moment, I just stood there, watching him. The morning light made everything look softer. His face, the lines of his shoulders, the way he cradled the mug like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. I cleared my throat softly and he glanced up, his expression neutral. "Morning," I said, stepping out onto the patio. "Morning," he replied, his voice low and even. I hesitated, unsure of how to approach him. He didn't look angry, but he didn't look inviting either. I pulled out the chair next to him and sat down, the metal cool against my skin. "You're up early," I said, trying to sound casual. "So are you," he said, not looking at me. I nodded, wrapping my arms around myself. The air was cooler than I'd expected, the faint smell of chlorine and last night's charcoal lingering in the breeze. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted. "Me neither." The silence between us was heavy but not quite as suffocating as it had been the night before. It was tentative, fragile, like we were both waiting to see who would break it first. "I've been thinking," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, "about what you said last night, about how I made you feel." He didn't respond right away, but I could see his jaw tighten, the faintest twitch of his fingers around the mug. "You're right," I continued, forcing myself to keep going even though my throat felt tight. I was so focused on defending myself that I didn't stop to think about how my words affected you, and that's not fair. You deserve better than that. He glanced at me then, his eyes searching mine for something. I wasn't sure if he found it, but he nodded slightly, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "I've been feeling off," I said, stumbling over the words. "About myself, I mean, and I think I've been taking it out on you without even realizing it. That's not an excuse, but I want you to know it's not about you. It never was." He set his mug down on the table and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Why didn't you just tell me that? He asked, his tone softer now, almost curious. I looked down at my hands, picking at the edge of my sleeve. I don't know, I admitted. I guess I didn't want to seem weak or like I couldn't handle it, but I see now that trying to hide it just made everything worse. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The sound of birds chirping in the distance filled the space between us, a reminder that the world was still moving, even as we sat there trying to piece ourselves back together. I get it, he said finally. More than you think, but that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. You can't just say whatever you want and expect me to brush it off, especially not in front of other people. I know, I said quickly. And I'm so sorry. I don't know why I said it. I wasn't thinking. I was just, I don't know, jealous maybe, or insecure, or both. But it wasn't fair to you, and I hate that I made you feel like you're not enough because you are. You're more than enough. He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. I need to know that this isn't going to happen again, he said. That you're not just saying all the right things now because you feel guilty. I need to feel like I can trust you not to hurt me like that again. The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I nodded, swallowing hard. I'll do whatever it takes to earn that trust back, I said, my voice shaking. I mean it. He studied me for another moment, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Okay, he said quietly, but it's going to take time. I understand, I said, relief flooding through me even as the heaviness in my chest remained. We sat there in silence after that, the morning sun warming the patio as we both stared out at the pool, the water shimmering like a fragile truce. The days that followed felt like walking on thin ice. Every conversation, every interaction, every look was laced with caution. I wasn't sure how to navigate the space between us, and it seemed like he wasn't either. We weren't fighting, but we weren't okay. Not yet. I tried to be more present, more mindful of the way I spoke to him. It felt clunky at first, like I was overcompensating. I'd catch myself second-guessing every sentence before it left my mouth, wondering if it would come across the wrong way, if it might somehow undo the fragile progress we'd made. He didn't seem to resent me for trying, but he didn't make it easier, either. His responses were measured, polite, but distant. He wasn't shutting me out exactly, but he wasn't letting me all the way in, and I hated it. I hated the uncertainty, the way it made me feel like I was on probation in my own marriage. One evening, a few days after the pool party, we were sitting on opposite ends of the couch. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching. I was scrolling through my phone, pretending not to notice how far apart we were when he broke the silence. Do you remember when we first started dating? He asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. I looked up, surprised. Of course, I said. Why? He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the screen, but I could tell his mind was somewhere else. You used to laugh at all my jokes, he said finally. I still do, I said, trying to keep my tone light. He shook his head, a small, almost sad smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. No, not like you did back then. Back then, it felt different. Like you actually thought I was funny. You are funny, I said quickly, but even as the words left my mouth, I realized how hollow they sounded. Am I? He asked, turning to look at me. His expression wasn't angry, but it wasn't warm either. It was searching. Because lately, it feels like I'm just the guy you tolerate, the guy you roll your eyes at, the guy you make fun of when you think it'll get a laugh. His words hit me like a slap, and I felt my face flush with shame. That's not true, I said, but my voice was barely above a whisper. Isn't it? He pressed, his gaze unwavering. I mean, be honest. When was the last time you looked at me like you did when we first started dating? When was the last time you made me feel like I was? Enough. There it was again, that word, enough. It echoed in my mind, heavy and accusatory. I don't know, I admitted, my throat tightening. I don't know when things changed, but I never stopped loving you. I need you to believe that. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. I want to believe it, he said quietly, but it's hard when your actions say otherwise. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I didn't have a defense. He wasn't wrong. I had changed. Somewhere along the line, I'd stopped being the woman who laughed at his jokes and started being the woman who rolled her eyes at them. I didn't know when it had happened or why, but I could see it now, as clear as day. I don't know how to fix this, I said finally, my voice breaking. I don't know how to go back to the way things were. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Maybe we can't," he said, "but we can try to move forward, if that's what you want." "It is," I said immediately, the desperation in my voice catching even me off guard. "I want that more than anything." "Okay," he said after a long pause. "Then we start here, but I need you to meet me halfway." "I will," I promised, the words spilling out before I could second-guess them. "I'll do whatever it takes." He nodded, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or at least the faintest glimmer of it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hold on to. We sat there for a while, not talking, just existing in the same space. The distance between us on the couch felt a little less vast, though it was still there. But for the first time in days, it felt like we were moving toward each other instead of away. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about what he'd said, about how I'd made him feel, about how I'd let my insecurities and frustrations chip away at the foundation of our relationship without even realizing it. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know if I ever would. But I knew one thing for certain. If I wanted to rebuild what we'd lost, I had to start with myself. The next morning, I woke up before him, the sunlight spilling through the blinds. For a few minutes, I just lay there, listening to his steady breathing. He was still asleep, his face softened in a way that only happened when he wasn't awake to carry the weight of everything between us. I thought about reaching out, running my fingers through his hair or brushing my hand across his, but something stopped me. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was fear of shattering the fragile peace we'd begun to rebuild. So I slipped out of bed quietly and headed to the kitchen instead. I decided to make breakfast, a real breakfast, not just toast or cereal. Something about cooking felt purposeful, like a way to show him I was trying, even if I couldn't yet put everything into words. As I cracked eggs into a bowl and whisked them, I thought about how often I'd brushed off the small gestures he made for me. The way he'd bring me coffee in the mornings or surprise me with my favorite snacks when he went grocery shopping. I'd always appreciated it, but I hadn't always shown it. I'd taken it for granted, assuming he knew how much those things meant to me without needing to hear it. By the time he came downstairs, the smell of bacon and coffee had filled the kitchen. He paused in the doorway, rubbing his eyes and looking almost surprised to see me standing at the stove. "Morning," I said, turning to smile at him. "Morning," he replied, his voice still rough with sleep. He glanced at the table where I'd set out plates, silverware, and a small vase with a single flower I'd picked from the yard. "What's all this?" "Breakfast," I said simply, flipping the last piece of bacon onto a plate. "I thought it might be nice to sit down and eat together for once." He hesitated, then nodded. "Smells good," he said, sitting down at the table. I brought the food over and poured him a cup of coffee, watching as he took his first sip. For a few moments, we ate in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't entirely relaxed either. There was still a tension between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything we hadn't yet worked through. "I've been thinking," I said finally, breaking the silence, "about what you said last night. About meeting you halfway." He looked up at me, his fork paused midair. "Yeah," I nodded, twisting my fingers together under the table. "I know I've been distant and critical, and I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to make you feel like you're not enough, because you are. You always have been." He didn't say anything right away, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "I appreciate that," he said eventually, "but it's not just about what you say, it's about what you do. I need to see that you mean it." "I know," I said quickly, "and I want to show you. I don't know where to start." "Start with honesty," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. "Not just with me, but with yourself. If you're feeling something, anything, don't bury it. Don't let it fester until it comes out in some careless comment at a pool party. Just tell me." His words stung, but I knew he was right. I'd spent so much time bottling up my insecurities, hiding them behind sarcasm and jokes, that I'd forgotten how to let myself be vulnerable. "I'll try," I said softly. "I promise I'll try," he nodded, and though his expression was guarded, I thought I saw a flicker of something softer beneath it. As the days turned into weeks, I made a conscious effort to follow through on my promise. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I caught myself slipping into old habits, rolling my eyes or brushing off his attempts at connection. But every time, I forced myself to stop and think about how my actions might be affecting him. I started asking him questions again, little things, like how his day was or what he thought about a movie we'd just watched. I started laughing at his jokes, even when they were corny, because I realized that his humor was part of what I'd fallen in love with in the first place. And slowly, things began to shift. The distance between us felt a little less vast, the silences a little less heavy. He started meeting me halfway too, offering small reassurances that he still cared, that he was still invested in us. One night, as we lay in bed, I turned to him and said something I hadn't said in a long time. "Thank you." He looked at me, his brow furrowed. "For what?" "For sticking with me," I said, my voice trembling. "For giving me a chance to make things right." His expression softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. A real smile, not the guarded one I'd grown used to. "You're worth it," he said simply. And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. It was a few weeks later when we found ourselves back at the pool. This time, it was just the two of us. The sky was an endless stretch of blue, and the sun cast dancing reflections on the water, the scene so serene it almost felt ironic given how much turmoil it had seen the last time we were here. I had been the one to suggest it, an olive branch of sorts. The pool party had left a shadow hanging over me, and I wanted to rewrite the memory, to make this place feel like ours again instead of a battlefield. We settled into the chairs by the edge of the pool, the sound of the water lapping against the tiles filling the silence between us. I had brought a book, but couldn't focus on the words. Instead, I found myself stealing glances at him, watching as he leaned back in his chair with his sunglasses on, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked relaxed, but I could tell he was still holding something back. That guarded edge hadn't disappeared completely, and I couldn't blame him for it. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild overnight, no matter how much you wanted to. "I was thinking," I said, breaking the silence. "Maybe we should go swimming together." He turned his head toward me, raising an eyebrow. "You hate getting your hair wet." I smiled a little, shrugging. "Maybe I can make an exception." He didn't respond right away, but I could see the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "All right," he said, pushing himself up from the chair. "You're on." We waded into the pool together, the water cool against my skin. I let out a small gasp as I adjusted to the temperature, and he chuckled. "Cold?" he asked, his voice teasing. "Just a little," I said, shivering dramatically for effect. We floated there for a moment, the water shimmering around us. It felt almost surreal to be so close to him, our movements in sync as we drifted toward the deeper end. I watched as he pushed his hair back, droplets of water clinging to his skin, and I felt a pang of something I hadn't felt in a long time, admiration, attraction, love. "You know," I said softly, my voice carrying across the stillness of the pool, "I never meant to hurt you that day." He looked at me, his eyes unreadable behind his sunglasses. "I know," he said after a moment. "I know I said it before, but I need you to hear it again," I continued, the words tumbling out of me. "I was wrong, and it wasn't just about that day. I've been wrong for a long time about a lot of things, but I see it now and I'm trying to be better. For you, for us." He was quiet for a long moment, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I hated how vulnerable I felt, how exposed, but I knew this was the only way forward. "I believe you," he said finally, his voice steady. "But it's not just about you being better, it's about us being better. Together." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I want that," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I want that more than anything." He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine under the water. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like a bridge being built between us. We stayed in the pool for what felt like hours, talking and laughing, and, for the first time in a long time, just being. There were no accusations, no heavy silences, just the two of us rediscovering what it meant to be a team. As the sun began to set, casting the pool in shades of gold and orange, I found myself thinking about how far we'd come, and how far we still had to go. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. And as we climbed out of the pool and wrapped ourselves in towels, I caught a glimpse of him smiling at me, a real, genuine smile. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The next day, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't that everything was magically better, far from it. But for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I understood where we had gone wrong. Not just me, not just him, but both of us. I realized how often I'd been waiting for him to fix things, to be the first to apologize, to close the gaps between us. And in doing so, I'd let myself off the hook. I'd convinced myself that as long as I wasn't the one pulling away first, I wasn't to blame for the distance. But the truth was messier than that. The truth was, I'd been just as responsible for the cracks in our foundation. Every time I held back a compliment or ignored an opportunity to connect, I was adding to the problem. Every time I let my insecurities dictate my actions, I was widening the gap. I couldn't fix everything overnight, but I could start. And starting meant being honest, not just with him, but with myself. That evening, I sat him down at the kitchen table. I'd been rehearsing what I wanted to say all day, but as I looked across at him, the words caught in my throat. He was looking at me expectantly, his hands folded in front of him, and for a moment I felt the weight of all the years we'd spent together pressing down on me. "I've been thinking a lot," I said finally, my voice trembling. "About us, about how we got here." He didn't say anything, just nodded for me to continue. "I know I've been hard on you," I said, my hands twisting in my lap. "And I think a lot of it has been because I've been hard on myself. I've let my own insecurities bleed into the way I treat you, and that's not fair. You deserve better than that." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching mine. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone cautious. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I mean that when I said what I said at the pool party, it wasn't about you." "Not really. It was about me. About how I feel about myself. I've been projecting my own issues onto you, and it's not okay. It's not fair." He was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally. "Why didn't you let me in instead of, I don't know, pushing me away?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Maybe I was scared. Maybe I didn't want to admit how messed up I was feeling. But I see it now, and I want to change. I want to be better, not just for you, but for me too. He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "That means a lot," he said quietly. "But it's not just about what you say, it's about what you do." "I know," I said, my throat tightening. "And I'm going to show you, I need you to be patient with me. I need you to believe in me." He reached across the table then, his hand covering mine. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental, like the first step toward rebuilding what we'd lost. "I do," he said, his voice steady. "I believe in us." For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope, not just for our relationship, but for myself. We sat there for a while, talking about everything and nothing, and as the evening stretched into night, I realized that this raw, honest connection was what I'd been missing. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was real, and that was enough to keep me going. As we went to bed that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from resolution, but the kind that came from knowing you were finally on the right path. And as I lay there, listening to the sound of his breathing beside me, I made a promise to myself. I would keep trying. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many times I stumbled, I would keep trying. Because he was worth it. Because we were worth it. A few days later, we were sitting on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was one of those evenings where the air was cool but not cold, the kind of perfect in-between that didn't demand anything from you. We hadn't planned to talk about anything in particular, but the quiet between us felt different now, not tense or uncomfortable, just open. I leaned back in my chair, wrapping my hands around a mug of tea. "Do you ever think about how we used to be?" I asked, breaking the silence. He glanced at me, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "What do you mean?" "Like back when we first got together," I said. "Before things got complicated." He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, I think about it sometimes." We were so young back then, so sure of everything. I laughed softly. "And so clueless." "Definitely clueless," he agreed, chuckling. For a moment we just sat there, the memory of who we used to be hovering between us like a ghost. It was strange to think about how far we'd come, how much we'd changed, both together and apart. "I miss it sometimes," I admitted, my voice quiet. Not just how simple things felt, but how I felt. I miss feeling light. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I could see something shift in his expression. "You've been carrying a lot," he said softly. "I think we both have." I nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't realize how heavy it was until it all came out that day. I think I'd been holding it in for so long, it just exploded. He didn't respond right away, but I could see the understanding in his eyes. "I think I've been doing the same," he said after a moment. I didn't want to admit it, but yeah, I've been carrying things too. That caught me off guard. He'd always seemed so steady, so sure of himself, even when I was unraveling. I'd convinced myself that he didn't struggle the way I did, that he didn't have the same doubts or fears. "What have you been carrying?" I asked hesitantly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "A lot of things," he said. "Feeling like I'm not enough, like no matter what I do, it's not good enough for you, like I'm always walking on eggshells, waiting for the next thing I'll do wrong." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd known, deep down, that my actions had hurt him, but hearing it laid out so plainly was like staring into a mirror and seeing all the ways I'd failed him reflected back at me. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." "I know," he said gently, "and I believe you, but it's not just about saying sorry. It's about figuring out how we can stop hurting each other like this." I nodded, blinking back tears. "I want to stop," I said. "I want to fix this." "So do I," he said. For the first time, I felt like we were on the same page, not just saying the right words to appease each other, but truly understanding where the other person was coming from. We sat there until the sun disappeared completely, the sky fading into shades of deep blue and black. And as the stars began to peek out, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from grand gestures or sweeping promises. It was quieter than that, more tentative, but it was real. That night, as we headed inside, I caught his hand in mine and gave it a squeeze. He looked at me, surprised, but he didn't pull away. "Thank you," I said softly. "For what?" "For staying," I said. "For trying." He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me, the softness in his eyes, the warmth in his expression, told me everything I needed to know. And as we walked upstairs together, our hands still intertwined, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. Not perfect, not fixed, but okay. Sometimes that's enough. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where vulnerability helped rebuild a connection? Let's talk about it, because growth, healing, and love all start with honest conversations.